They thought she was weak. They thought her silence was an admission of guilt. For 3 days, Elena sat in that cold courtroom, watching her billionaire ex-husband and his ruthless lawyer tear her life apart with lies. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She just watched. Everyone, the jury, the gallery, even her own counsel, thought it was over. But they didn't know that Elena wasn't silent because she was afraid. She was silent because she was waiting for the one specific question that would bring the entire empire crashing down. When Judge Morrison finally asked it, the answer didn't just end a marriage. It destroyed a legacy. You won't believe what she was holding back. The mahogany doors of courtroom 6C in the Superior Court of Boston felt heavy, not just with wood and brass, but with the suffocating weight of inevitable defeat. The air conditioner hummed a low, monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate against the tension in the room. Richard Blackwell adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, a subtle smirk playing on his lips. He didn't look like a man fighting for his assets. He looked like a man who had already bought the victory and was just waiting for the receipt. At 42, Richard was the golden boy of the tech pharmaceutical industry, a man whose smile had graced the cover of Forbes and whose handshake was rumored to be worth millions. Sitting beside him was his attorney, Marcus Sterling, a man known in legal circles as the Butcher. Sterling didn't just win cases. He eviscerated the opposition until there was nothing left but dust and regret. And on the bench behind him sat Isabella, Richard's fiancée, 24 years old, impeccably dressed in a modest cream suit that screamed innocent stepmother, clutching a designer purse with white-knuckled anticipation. On the other side of the aisle sat Elena. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, her hair pulled back in severe, practical bun. She looked tired, not the frantic, hysterical exhaustion of a woman scorned, but the deep, bone-weary fatigue of someone who had been swimming against the current for too long. Her hands rested folded on the table, still as stone. Mr. Sterling, you may proceed with your closing arguments regarding the custody arrangement, Judge Morrison said, peering over his spectacles. The judge was a stern man, nearing 70, who had zero patience for theatrics, yet his courtroom had become a theater of cruelty for the past week. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. Thank you, Your Honor. The facts here are indisputable. My client, Mr. Blackwell, provides a stable, affluent, and intellectually stimulating environment for his children. He has the resources, the time, and the dedication. Sterling walked slowly toward the jury box, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The respondent, on the other hand, Elena, while we sympathize with her current financial struggles brought on, I might add, by her own lack of ambition and questionable investments, we cannot ignore the instability, the emotional volatility. Richard nodded solemnly, looking down at the table as if pained by the truth. It was a perfect performance. We have heard testimony from Anani's, Sterling continued, gesturing vaguely. We have heard from the house staff. Mrs. Blackwell, excuse me, Ms. Martinez, has been described as distant, distracted, perhaps even negligent. Is this the environment for 2 young children? A small apartment in a questionable district with a mother who refuses to move on. Elena didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead at the great seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts hanging above the judge's head. In the gallery, whispers rippled through the onlookers. The press was there, hungry for the fall of a socialite. They had already written the headlines. Blackwell victory inevitable. Sad end for the quiet wife. She hasn't said a word, Isabella whispered to her friend in the second row, loud enough for the back of the room to hear. It's practically an admission. She knows she's unfit. Richard leaned over to Sterling as the lawyer returned to the table. Wrap it up. I have a board meeting at 4. It's already done, Richard, Sterling murmured, shuffling his papers. Look at her. She's broken. But Elena wasn't broken. She was counting. The afternoon session dragged on. Elena's lawyer, a court-appointed public defender named Rachel Thompson, looked out of her depth. Rachel was young, earnest, and completely overwhelmed by the mountain of fabricated evidence Sterling had dumped on her desk 3 days prior. Your Honor, Rachel said, her voice shaking slightly as she stood up, my client loves her children. The accusations of negligence are based entirely on the testimony of staff currently on Mr. Blackwell's payroll. That is a clear conflict of interest. Objection, Sterling barked, not even bothering to stand up fully. Relevance, the witnesses were under oath. Sustained, Judge Morrison sighed, rubbing his temples. Miss Thompson, unless you have concrete evidence refuting the household staff's claims, move on. Rachel looked down at Elena, desperation in her eyes. Elena, you have to give me something. You told me you had a plan. We're losing everything here, the alimony, the house, the kids. He's destroying you. Elena turned her head slowly. Her eyes were a striking, piercing green, and for the first time in days, they held a spark. Not yet, Rachel. Wait for the finances. The finances? Rachel hissed. We've gone over finances. He's hidden it all in shell companies. We can't prove it without a forensic accountant, and the judge denied our request for more time. Just wait, Elena said softly. The focus of the trial shifted to the division of assets. This was Richard's playground. He had built an empire, and it ensured that, on paper, he was nearly destitute. Richard took the stand. He looked a picture of humble success. Mr. Blackwell, Sterling asked smoothly, can you explain to the court the current state of your liquid assets? Richard sighed, a tragic expression on his face. It's been a hard year for the market. The pharmaceutical sector took a hit. Most of my wealth is tied up in stock that I legally cannot sell for another 5 years. My liquid cash, it's minimal, barely enough to cover the legal fees and the maintenance of the properties. I've offered Elena a generous settlement of $5,000 a month, which I think is more than fair considering the company's fragility. $5,000 a month. It was an insult. It wouldn't even cover rent in the school district where their children attended. And what are the offshore accounts Ms. Martinez alluded to in her initial filing? Sterling asked, setting up the spike. Richard laughed, a short, incredulous sound. Fiction, pure fantasy. I am an American businessman. I pay my taxes. I keep my money where I can see it. Elena has always had a vivid imagination. I think she's confusing my business trips to the Caymans with banking trips. I went there to scout locations for a retreat center. Nothing more. Judge Morrison nodded, taking notes. He looked at Elena. She was staring at Richard. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers were tapping a rhythm on the table. Tap, tap, tap. Do you wish to cross-examine Miss Thompson? The judge asked. Rachel stood up, looking at her notes. She opened her mouth, but Elena's hand shot out, gripping Rachel's wrist. No, Elena said, her voice clear and startlingly loud in the quiet room. Judge Morrison frowned. Ms. Martinez, you are speaking out of turn, but are you instructing your counsel to decline cross-examination? I am, Elena said. She stood up. She wasn't tall, but in that moment, she seemed to loom over the defense table. Actually, Your Honor, I would like to speak for myself now. Sterling chuckled. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. She has counsel. I have the right to address the court regarding the welfare of my children and the validity of these financial claims, Elena said, her voice steady. And I believe Mr. Blackwell has forgotten one very small, very important detail about our marriage. Richard rolled his eyes. Here we go. The hysterics. Judge Morrison looked intrigued. He was bored of Sterling's slick maneuvering. He wanted to see what the quiet woman in gray had to say. Very well, but tread carefully, Miss Martinez. This is a court of law, not a therapy session. What is this detail? Elena walked around the table. She didn't walk toward the witness stand. She walked toward the center of the room, directly in front of the judge, turning her back on Richard. The detail, Elena said, is that before I was a housewife, and before I was a mother, Mr. Blackwell seems to have forgotten what I did for a living. Richard frowned. He actually had to think about it. He had met Elena at a charity gala 10 years ago. She was volunteering. He assumed she came from old money or was just a social climber. He never really asked. I was an archivist, Elena said, for the State Department. Sterling scoffed. And this is relevant how? You filed papers. Congratulations. An archivist specializing in forensic data recovery and encrypted communications, Elena corrected, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. I didn't just file papers. I found things that people tried very hard to delete. The room went silent. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. For 10 years, Elena continued, pacing slowly, I played the role Richard wanted. The quiet wife. The trophy. I let him think I didn't understand how his business worked. I let him think I was too busy with the children to notice when he changed his passwords. I let him think I was stupid. She turned to face Richard. But I have a photographic memory, Richard, and I have a habit of backing up hard drives. Objection! Sterling roared, jumping to his feet. This is ambushing. There is no evidence submitted. Actually, Elena interrupted, pulling a small black USB drive from the pocket of her gray dress. I submitted this to the bailiff this morning under seal, marked for emergency review regarding perjury. Judge Morrison's eyebrows shot up. He looked at the bailiff, who nodded and handed a manila envelope to the bench. You stayed quiet, Judge Morrison noted, opening the envelope. You let him lie under oath. I needed him to confirm it, Elena said. I needed him to state, on the record, under penalty of perjury, that the Cayman accounts didn't exist. Because if I had shown this earlier, he would have settled. He would have spun it. But now he has committed a felony in front of you. Richard's face went pale. He leaned toward Sterling. What is on that drive? I don't know, Sterling hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. You told me she was a nobody. Judge Morrison plugged the drive into his laptop. The courtroom waited. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. The judge clicked a few files. His eyes widened. He adjusted his glasses. He scrolled and scrolled. He looked up, his face thunderous. Mr. Blackwell, the judge said, his voice dangerously low, according to these bank statements, which seem to be authenticated by the bank's own digital signature keys, you have $75 million sitting in an account in the name of Isabella Properties, LLC. The gallery gasped. All eyes turned to Isabella. She shrieked, dropping her designer bag. I didn't know. He just asked me to sign some papers. Sit down, Sterling snapped at her. But that's not the question that matters, Elena said, cutting through the chaos. The money is just money. You can sanction him for that. But there is something else on that drive. Your Honor. Folder 3, the audio files. Richard stood up. Stop this. This is illegal recording. Spousal privilege. Not in a one-party consent state. And not when a recording captures a commission of a crime involving a minor, Elena said calmly. Judge Morrison held up a hand, silencing Richard. Mr. Blackwell, sit down or I will have you shackled. Miss Martinez, what is the unexpected question you mentioned in your filing? Elena took a deep breath. This was it, the moment she had waited 3 hellish days for. Ask him, Elena said, pointing a shaking finger at her ex-husband. Ask him where he was on the night of October 14th, the night our son Noah ended up in the emergency room with a broken arm. Richard froze. He looked like a deer in headlights. The arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. October 14th, Judge Morrison asked, looking at the timeline. The report says the child fell down the stairs while under the care of the nanny. Ask him, Elena repeated. Judge Morrison looked at Richard. Mr. Blackwell, where were you on the night of October 14th? Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Sterling. Sterling looked away. I was at a gala, the Met Aid charity dinner. There are photos. Elena shook her head. Play the file, Your Honor. File named October 14th Baby Monitor. Judge Morrison clicked the file. The sound of static filled the courtroom. Then a door slamming. Then Richard's voice. Not the smooth public voice, but a slurred, angry growl. I told you to get out of my way, you little brat. A child's cry. Noah. Daddy, no. Stop. A loud thud. A sickening crack. Silence. Then Isabella's voice on the recording. Richard. Oh my God. You pushed him. He's not moving. Richard, we have to call 911. Richard's voice again, cold and sober. No. Call the nanny. Tell her she doesn't say he fell. She'll never work in this town again. Fix this, Isabella. I'm going to the gala. The recording ended. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was deafening. It was the sound of a life ending. Isabella was sobbing into her hands. Richard was gripping the table, so hard his knuckles were white. Judge Morrison slowly closed the laptop. He took off his glasses. He looked at Richard with a look of pure disgust that transcended his judicial role. "Mr. Blackwell," the judge said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, "I have heard enough." The silence that had gripped the courtroom shattered like a glass pane dropped from a skyscraper. "This is a fabrication." Richard Blackwell screamed, his face a mask of contorted rage. He lunged toward the defense table, sweeping a stack of files onto the floor. "She manipulated the audio. That's AI generated. I demand a forensic analysis." Judge Morrison slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking through the air like a gunshot. Bang, bang, bang. "Sit down, Mr. Blackwell," the judge roared, his voice projecting with a terrifying authority that made the gallery flinch. "You are in a court of law, not a boardroom where you can bully your way into submission." Marcus Sterling, the butcher, looked as though he had swallowed a live coal. He was a man who prided himself on reading the room, on knowing when to push and when to fold. But this was a nuclear detonation. He physically recoiled from his client, taking a distinct step to the left. "Your Honor," Sterling stammered, his usual oil-slick confidence evaporated. I must request a recess. I need to confer with my client regarding these new—" "There will be no recess." Judge Morrison cut him off, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. He looked down at the laptop, then back at the trembling Isabella, and finally at Richard. "The court is in possession of evidence suggesting the commission of a violent felony against a minor, as well as perjury committed in my presence regarding financial assets." "Bailiff." Two uniformed officers stepped forward from the back of the room, the jingle of heavy keys cutting through the murmurs of the press. Richard's eyes went wide. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to fix it. He looked at Isabella, but she was curled in on herself, weeping silently, mascara running down her pristine cream suit. He looked at Sterling, but the lawyer was already packing his briefcase, his eyes fixed studiously on the floor. Finally, Richard looked at Elena. She hadn't moved. She stood in the center of the aisle, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was simply watching him with a detached, clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. It was that look, that utter lack of fear, that terrified him more than the judge. "Elena!" Richard gasped, his voice cracking. "Elena! Tell them it's a misunderstanding. Think about the company. Think about the share price. If I'm arrested, everything collapses. The children's inheritance." "The children are safe," Elena said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "That is the only inheritance that matters." The bailiffs reached him. One of them, a burly man named Officer Davis, took Richard's arm. "Richard Blackwell, place your hands behind your back." "Don't touch me." Richard snarled, trying to yank his arm away. "Do you know who I am? I know the governor. I will have your badge." "Resisting arrest isn't going to help your case, son," Judge Morrison observed dryly. "Add a contempt charge to the docket." The click of the handcuffs was metallic and final. It was a sound Richard had never expected to hear in relation to his own wrists. He was shoved forward, stumbling slightly, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing against the linoleum. As he was marched past Elena, he leaned in, his breath hot and frantic. "You think you've won?" he hissed, spittle flying. "I have lawyers you can't even dream of. I'll bury you. I'll make sure you never see a dime. I'll kill you, Elena." The threat hung in the air. Judge Morrison's face went stone cold. Let the record show the respondent just issued a death threat against a petitioner in open court. Bail is denied. Remand to custody immediately. Sterling closed his eyes and sighed. He knew the retainer fee he had charged wouldn't cover this mess. As a heavy side door swallowed Richard and the officers, the courtroom erupted. Reporters were shouting questions, typing furiously on phones. Flashbulbs from the hallway popped through the glass panes. "Miss Martinez." Judge Morrison said, his voice softening as he turned to Elena. "Regarding the custody petition, granted, sole legal and physical custody to the mother. Mr. Blackwell's visitation rights are suspended pending a criminal investigation and a psychiatric evaluation. And regarding the assets, the judge tapped the USB drive. I am freezing all accounts associated with Mr. Blackwell and Isabella Properties, LLC, effective immediately. Miss Thompson, I suggest you file a motion for immediate spousal support drawn from these seized funds. I'll sign it before I leave for lunch." Rachel Thompson, Elena's young lawyer, looked like she had just won the lottery. She was shaking. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Thank you." Elena nodded her thanks to the judge. She turned and walked back to her table, picking up her worn purse. She didn't look at the press. She didn't look at Isabella, who was now being questioned by a marshal. She walked down the center aisle, her head held high. As she pushed open the courtroom doors, the wall of noise from the hallway hit her. Cameras, microphones, shouting faces. "Elena! Elena, is it true he hit the boy?" "Mrs. Blackwell, how much money is in the offshore account?" "Did you know about the mistress?" Elena stopped. She put on a pair of oversized sunglasses, shielding her eyes. She looked at the camera of the largest network present, CNN. "My name," she said, her voice calm and steady, "is Elena Martinez, and I have no comment. The evidence speaks for itself." She walked through the crowd, parting them like the sea. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a storm. It took 48 hours for Richard Blackwell's high-priced legal team to find a loophole. While bail had been denied initially, a frantic appeal to a higher court, greased by political favors and a claim of health concerns regarding Richard's heart condition, a condition he mysteriously developed the moment he stepped into a holding cell, got him released on house arrest. The bond was set at $10 million. He paid within the hour, liquidating a secret crypto wallet that Elena had included in the first data dump. Richard returned to his penthouse at the Obsidian Tower in downtown Boston on a rainy Thursday evening. The ride home in the black SUV was silent. His driver, usually chatty, didn't make eye contact in the rear-view mirror. Richard sat in the back, nursing a glass of scotch he had poured from the car's bar. His hands were shaking. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was furious, a cold, calculating fury that sharpened his mind. "She embarrassed me," he thought, watching the city lights blur past. "She humiliated me in front of Morrison, in front of the press." He checked his phone. The stock for Blackwell Pharmaceuticals had tanked 18% in 2 days. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting for Friday morning. He had to get ahead of this. He had to spin the narrative. The car pulled up to private entrance. He swept inside, ignoring the doorman, and took the elevator to the 50th floor. The penthouse was dark. He frowned. Usually the lights were on, the ambient set. "Isabella," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast modern foyer. No answer. He walked into the living room, tossing his keys on the marble island. "Isabella, I told you to have dinner ready. I've been eating prison slop for 2 days." Still silence. He walked up the floating staircase to the master bedroom. The door was open. He stepped inside and froze. The room was stripped. The closet doors were flung wide open, the hangers bare. The jewelry box on the vanity was gone. The safe in the wall was open and empty. On the bed, there was a single piece of paper. Richard walked over and picked it up. It was a note written in Isabella's looping, childish handwriting. "Richard, I saw the news. They're saying you might get 10 years for child abuse. I can't be a prison wife. It's not part of my brand. Also, the feds came by. They asked about the LLC. I told them everything. Richard, I told them you made me sign the papers. I told them about the accounts in Zurich. 2. I made a deal for immunity. Don't look for me. I'm in Paris." Richard crumpled the note in his fist and screamed, a guttural sound of pure rage. He threw a crystal lamp across the room, shattering it against the wall. "Traitor," he howled. "Useless, gold-digging traitor." He paced the room, his breathing ragged. Okay. Isabella was gone. Good riddance. She was a liability anyway. He still had the company. He still had the core IP. As long as he controlled the patents for NeuroAdvance, the Alzheimer's drug that was set to launch next quarter, he was untouchable. The board wouldn't dare fire him. He was the company. He needed to check the secure servers. He needed to make sure the R&D files were locked down so Elena couldn't get to them. He ran to his home office, booting up his massive desktop computer. He typed in his password. Access denied. He frowned. He typed it again. Access denied. What the hell? He pulled out his phone and dialed the IT director, a man named Gary. Gary, why am I locked out of mainframe? Richard barked. There was a long pause on the other end. Mr. Blackwell. Oh, sir, your credentials have been revoked. Revoked? By whom? I am the CO. By the acting chairwoman, sir. Richard froze. Acting chairwoman? We don't have a chairwoman. We have a chairman. Old man Priest. Mr. Priest resigned yesterday, sir, Gary said, his voice trembling. The majority shareholder called for a restructuring. She appointed herself chairwoman this morning. She... Howard whispered, a cold dread seeping into his bones. Who is she? I can't see the full name on the file, sir. It just says EM Holdings. M. Elena Martinez. Richard dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor. How? How could she be the majority shareholder? He owned 51% of the stock. He had checked the portfolio 1,000 times. Unless he remembered something Elena had said in court. I didn't just file papers. I found things. 10 years ago, when he started the company, he had used seed money from an anonymous angel investor to buy out his early partners. He never knew who the investor was. The deal was brokered through a blind trust in Singapore. He had assumed it was some oil tycoon or a venture capital fund. He scrambled to his filing cabinet, tearing through old papers until he found the original incorporation documents. He flipped to the addendum about the series of funding. Investor? The Chimera Trust. He had never looked into the Chimera Trust. He just cashed the check. He ran back to the computer. He couldn't log into the company's server, but he could check public records. He searched Chimera Trust ownership. The screen loaded. Trustee, Elena Martinez. Beneficiaries, the Blackwell children. Richard fell back into his leather chair, the air leaving his lungs. She had funded him. All those years ago, when they were first dating, when he thought she was a broke student. She had money. No, not money. Information. He remembered now. Her father hadn't been a nobody. Her father was Alexander Martinez, the cryptic mathematician who designed high-frequency trading algorithms for Wall Street in the 90s. He had died mysteriously, leaving no will. Everyone thought he died broke. Elena had the money all along. She had bought 40% of his company before they were even married. And with the 15% she gained in the divorce settlement appearing imminent, she owned him. She had owned him from the very beginning. The phone on his desk rang. It was the landline. Only a few people had that number. He picked it up slowly. Hello? Hello, Richard. It was her. Her voice was calm, devoid of the fear she used to fake. Elena, he breathed. You were the angel investor. I believed in the science, Richard, she said. I believed NeuroAdvance could save lives. I didn't realize the man running the company was a cancer. You can't do this, he said, trying to find his footing. I built this company. I am the face of Blackwell Pharma. Not anymore, Elena said. The board meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m. I suggest you bring a box for your personal effects. Security will escort you out if you linger. I'll fight you, Richard shouted. I'll sue you for fraud. You hid assets. I had nothing, Elena replied smoothly. The trust was always public record. You were just too arrogant to read the fine print. You were too busy staring at yourself in the mirror to notice who was paying for the frame. I'm coming for you, Elena, he snarled. Come, she said. I'll be waiting in your chair. The line went dead. Friday morning broke with a gray, relentless drizzle that washed over Boston, turning the glass skyscrapers into weeping monoliths. The headquarters of Blackwell Pharmaceuticals was a fortress of steel and glass in the financial district. The boardroom on the 40th floor offered a panoramic view of the Boston Harbor, a view intended to intimidate anyone sitting on the opposite side of the massive oak table. At 8:55 a.m., the room was full. The board of directors sat in uneasy silence. There was Jonathan Priest, the former chair, looking pale and defeated. There was Vivian Chun, the representative for the Asian markets, tapping her stylus nervously against her tablet. There was Maxwell Carter, the CFO, who was sweating profusely despite the climate control. They were waiting. At 9 a.m. sharp, the double doors swung open. Richard Blackwell strode in. He looked impeccable. He had spent 2 hours in grooming. His suit was a sharp navy blue, his tie a power red. He walked with the swagger of a man who refused to believe the sky was falling. "Good morning," Richard announced, ignoring the tension. He walked to the head of the table. "I trust we are all ready to discuss the strategy for mitigating this recent PR hiccup." He reached for the leather chair at the head of the table. "That seat is taken, Richard," a voice said from the corner. Richard spun around. Elena was standing by the window. She wasn't wearing the gray, frumpy dress from the courtroom. She was wearing a tailored black suit that fit her like armor. Her hair was down, cascading in waves over her shoulders. She wore heels that clicked sharply on the hardwood floor as she walked toward him. "Elena?" Richard scoffed. "This is a closed meeting. Security." He motioned to the guard by the door. The guard, a man Richard had employed for 5 years, didn't move. He stared straight ahead. "Security works for the company," Richard, Elena said, stopping a few feet from him. "And as of 8 a.m. this morning, I control 55% of the voting shares." She tossed a thick document onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "What is this?" Richard sneered. "That," Vivian spoke up, her voice trembling slightly, "is the motion for your immediate removal, SEO, citing the moral turpitude clause in your contract." Richard laughed. "Moral turpitude? Because of a domestic dispute? Don't make me laugh. I generated $400 million in revenue last year. You also embezzled $12 million, Maxwell Carter, the CFO, whispered. He looked at Richard with apologetic eyes. "She found it, Richard. She found the routing numbers to the shell companies in Cyprus. She sent the file to all of us this morning." Richard froze. He looked at Maxwell. You ratted me out?" "I didn't have to," Maxwell said. "She had the logs. She had the keystroke data from your laptop. She's had it for 6 months." Richard looked back at Elena. She was standing at the head of the table now, her hand resting on the back of the chair, his chair. "You watched me," Richard whispered. "All this time, you were in my house, sleeping in my bed, and you were spying on me." "I was protecting my children's future," Elena corrected him. "You were draining the company dry to fund your lifestyle and your mistress. You were jeopardizing the FDA approval of Neuroadvance by cutting corners on the safety trials to save money. I saw those emails, too." The room gasped. Faking safety data was a death sentence for a pharma company. "That's a lie," Richard shouted. "Is it?" Elena pulled a remote from her pocket and pointed it at the wall screen. An email chain appeared. It was from Richard to the head of R&D. Subject: Clinical Trials Phase 3. From R. Blackwell. Body: I don't care about the side effects in the test group. Bury the nausea data. We need a launch by Q3 or the stock dips. Fix it. This," Elena said, gesturing to the screen, "is why you are being fired. Not because you are a bad husband. Not because you are a bad father, although you are both. You are being fired because you are a fraud." She looked at the board. "All in favor of the motion to terminate Richard Blackwell, effective immediately?" Every hand went up. Even Maxwell Carter raised his hand. Richard stared at them, his allies, his sycophants. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I am Blackwell Pharma." "Not anymore," Elena said. "We're rebranding. Effective Monday, the company will be known as Martinez Biosciences." She pointed to the door. "Get out." Richard stood there, shaking. His face turned a violent shade of red. He balled his fists. For a second, he looked like he might strike her, just like he had struck Noah. Don't even think about it. A deep voice rumbled. Richard turned. Standing behind Elena was a man he hadn't noticed. He was tall, wearing a simple suit, but he carried himself with a military bearing. "Who the hell are you?" Richard spat. "My name is Detective Davis," the man said. "I'm with the Securities and Exchange Commission." He stepped forward, flashing a badge and pulling out a fresh pair of handcuffs. "And this is an indictment for securities fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage." Richard looked from the handcuffs to Elena. She was sitting in the chair now. She looked comfortable. She looked powerful. "You planned this," Richard choked out. "You planned the timing, the court case, the board meeting, the SEC. "I told you, Richard," Elena said, opening a file folder on the desk. "I'm an archivist. I like things to be organized." She didn't look up as the detective spun Richard around and cuffed him. She didn't watch as he was dragged out of the room, screaming obscenities. She simply picked up a pen. "Now," Gray said to the stunned room of executives, "let's discuss the cleanup." 3 months had passed since the boardroom coup. But for Richard Blackwell, time had become a meaningless loop of gray concrete and fluorescent lights. He was being held at the Federal Detention Center in Plymouth County, awaiting trial. The bail for the SEC charges had been set at an astronomical $50 million, a sum he couldn't pay, as his assets were frozen and his friends had evaporated like mist in the morning sun. He wore an orange jumpsuit now, a stark contrast to the Italian wool he had favored. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was growing out gray and patchy. He had lost weight. "You have a visitor," the guard grunted, banging on the bars. Richard sat up on his cot. A spark of hope ignited in his chest. Sterling? No. Sterling had quit. Isabella? Maybe she had come back to recant. A new lawyer? He was shuffled down the hallway, chains rattling around his ankles, into the visitation room. He sat behind the thick plexiglass. Elena sat on the other side. She looked radiant. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans, her hair loose. She looked 5 years younger than she had in the courtroom. She didn't look like a CEO or a conqueror. She just looked free. Richard grabbed the receiver phone. "You came," he rasped. "I knew you'd come. You still love me, don't you?" Somewhere deep down. Elena picked up the phone slowly. Her expression was pitying, which hurt Richard more than anger. "I came to bring you these, Richard." She held up a document to the glass. It was a drawing, a crude crayon drawing of a superhero dog fighting a green monster. Noah drew it, Elena said. His therapist said it was a breakthrough. "The green monster, that's you, Richard." Richard flinched. "I'm his father. You can't turn him against me." "I didn't have to," Elena said calmly. "You did that when you broke his arm, because you were late for a party. You did that when you screamed at him for existing. It was an accident," Richard hissed, leaning forward, his breath fogging the glass. "Listen to me, Elena. We can make a deal. I know where the crypto keys are for the other wallet, the one you didn't find. There's $20 million in there. I'll give it to you. Just tell the DA you exaggerated. Tell them I was under stress. Get the charges dropped to a misdemeanor." Elena stared at him. "You still don't get it, do you? I don't want your money. I have the company. I have my own money. And most importantly, I have my dignity." "You can't run that company," Richard shouted. "You're an archivist, a librarian. You don't know how to handle the sharks." "The company is doing better than ever," Elena said, a small smile playing on her lips. "We released the real safety data for NeuroAdvance. The stock took a hit initially, but then it rebounded when the public realized we were being transparent. We have integrity now, Richard, something you never bought. Integrity doesn't buy yachts." "No," Elena agreed, "but it buys sleep. I sleep very well at night. Richard, do you?" Richard slammed the receiver against the metal counter. "Get me out of here. You owe me. I gave you a life." "You gave me a cage," Elena corrected. "And I spent 10 years learning how to pick the lock." She stood up. "I won't be visiting again, Richard. The divorce was finalized this morning. You didn't sign the papers, so the judge granted a default judgment. I have full custody. You have no visitation rights. A restraining order is in place for if you get out. Wait! Richard panicked. Elena, please. I'm scared. The other inmates, they know I was rich. They know about the child abuse charge. They look at me like I'm meat. For a moment, Elena hesitated. She looked at the man she had once promised to love and cherish. She saw the fear in his eyes, the pathetic, naked terror of a bully who has lost a stick. I can't help you with that, Richard, she said softly. You built this world for yourself. You lied, you cheated, and you hurt the weak. Now you're in a place where the rules are different. Good luck. She hung up the phone. As she walked away, she could hear him screaming her name through the glass, a muffled, desperate sound that faded as a heavy steel door clicked shut behind her. 1 year later, the crystal chandeliers of the Fairmont Copley Plaza Hotel didn't just glow. They seemed to hum with the collective energy of Boston's elite. It was a stark, glittering contrast to the sterile, gray misery of the courtroom where Elena Martinez had stood exactly 1 year ago. Tonight, the air didn't smell of stale coffee and desperation. It smelled of expensive perfume, aged champagne, and the intoxicating aroma of triumph. The gala for the Martinez Foundation for Domestic Recovery was officially the most coveted ticket of the season. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, filled with faces that had once turned away from Elena when she was merely Richard Blackwell's quiet wife. Now they craned their necks just to catch a glimpse of her. Elena stood near the velvet-draped entrance, smoothing the fabric of her emerald gown. It was a bold choice, a vibrant, living green that stood out against a sea of safe black dresses. She wasn't hiding in the gray anymore. Mom, are you nervous? Elena looked down. Noah was tugging at her hand. At 8 years old, he looked dashing in a miniature tuxedo, his bow tie slightly askew. But it wasn't the suit that made Elena's chest tighten with emotion. It was his stance. He stood tall, his eyes, once darting and fearful, scanning the room for a father's unpredictable temper, were bright and mischievous. The cast was long gone, and the phantom pains of that terrible October night had faded into a memory he rarely visited. A little bit, Elena admitted, kneeling to straighten his tie. There are a lot of people here. They're nice people, Noah said confidently, scanning the crowd. Not like the old ones. And look, Detective Davis is here. He promised to show me his badge again. Elena smiled, watching her son dart off toward the buffet table where the burly SEC detective was awkwardly balancing a plate of hors d'oeuvres. Seeing Noah fearless, that was the only victory that truly mattered. The company, the money, the reputation. It was all just insulation to keep that little boy safe. A hush fell over the room as the lights dimmed. A spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the podium. Elena walked up the stairs. The silence that greeted her now wasn't the heavy, judgmental silence of the trial. It was a silence of reverence, of anticipation. She gripped the sides of the podium, taking a moment to look out at the hundreds of faces. She saw Rachel Thompson, her former public defender turned general counsel, wiping a tear from her eye. She saw the board members of Martinez Biosciences, who looked at her now with terrified respect. Thank you all for coming, Elena began, her voice steady and amplified, filling the cavernous room. A year ago, she continued, I sat in a chair, not unlike the ones you are sitting in now, though far less comfortable. I sat there for 3 days and listened to a man tell the world that I was weak. He told the jury and the press that I was silent because I was broken. He said my lack of defense was an admission of guilt. She paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. We live in a world that rewards volume, Elena said, her gaze sweeping across the balcony level. We are taught that the person shouting the loudest is the one in charge. The bullies, the braggarts, the ones who interrupt. We are taught to fear their noise. She leaned in closer to the microphone. But I learned something in that courtroom. I learned that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is the sound of a weapon being loaded. Sometimes silence is the architecture of a trap. I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was waiting, I was listening. I was gathering the truth while he was busy shouting lies. A few people in the front row nodded. The connection was palpable. "Tonight, this foundation is a promise," Elena concluded, her voice rising with conviction. "A promise to anyone who feels trapped by a loud, powerful voice. We will help you find your own. And we will remind the world that the truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be heard at the right moment." The applause didn't just start. It exploded. It was a thunderous standing ovation that shook the floorboards. Elena didn't shrink from it. She stood there, bathing in it, accepting it. Not for herself, but for the woman she had been, the woman who had almost let herself disappear. An hour later, as the gala transitioned into soft jazz and mingling, Elena found herself cornered near the terrace doors. "Ms. Martinez," a gravelly voice rasped, "or I suppose I should address you as Madam Chairwoman now." Elena turned to find Judge Morrison leaning on a cane, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. He had retired 6 months ago, his legacy cemented by the high-profile Blackwell case. He looked older, softer out his robes, but his eyes were still sharp as flint. "Elena is fine, Judge," she said warmly, offering her hand. "I'm glad you came." "I wouldn't have missed it," Morrison chuckled. "You know, in 40 years on the bench, I've seen every manner of liar, thief, and charlatan. I've seen innocent men look guilty and guilty men look like saints. But I never saw a takedown quite like yours." He stepped closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You played a dangerous game. Elena," waiting for me to ask that specific question, "what if I hadn't asked about October 14th? What if I had just signed the papers?" "I knew you wouldn't," Elena said, her expression serious. "I did my research on you, Judge, just like I did on Richard. I knew you had a grandson the same age as Noah. I knew you had zero tolerance for bullies. I just needed to provoke Richard enough to make him show you his real face. I needed him to threaten me. I needed him to lose control." "You used his arrogance against him," Morrison mused, shaking his head in admiration. "Judo, using the opponent's weight to throw him. He had the money. He had the power," Elena replied. "All I had were the details and the patience." "Well," Morrison said, clinking his glass against hers, "it worked. I hear our mutual acquaintance is currently working in the laundry unit at Plymouth Federal, making 12 cents an hour folding sheets. I'm told he's adjusting poorly to the lack of room service." "It's honest work," Elena said without a trace of bitterness. "It might be the first honest work Richard has ever done in his life." They shared a laugh, a sound of closure. "Go enjoy your party, Elena," Morrison said, gesturing to the room. "You earned it." Elena smiled and slipped out through the glass doors onto the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the Boston skyline scrubbed clean and glittering against the dark expanse of the harbor. The air was cold, crisp, and biting, a stark difference from the suffocating, recycled air of her old life. She walked to the railing, gripping the cold metal, feeling the wind whip through her hair. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a builder. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She pulled it out. It was a text message from Dr. Aris, the lead researcher she had promoted after firing Richard's cronies. Incoming message, 10:42 p.m. Subject, FDA update. "Elena, we just got the call. NeuroAdvance has received full approval. The safety data you released save the application. We start production Monday. This is going to change millions of lives. You did this." Elena stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. Tears prickled at the corners, hot and fast. This was the vindication she hadn't realized she needed. Richard had used the company as a piggy bank. She had turned it back into a beacon of hope. Her father's algorithms, her own meticulous archiving, her years of silence. It had all led to this. She looked down at the city streets below, tiny cars moving like blood through a vein. She thought about the woman she used to be, the invisible archivist hiding in the shadows of a narcissist's ego, terrified to speak, terrified to move. She wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had died in courtroom 6C. So this one could be born. Elena turned back toward the warmth of the ballroom. Through the glass, she saw Noah laughing, showing his drawing to a fascinated Detective Davis. She saw her future, unwritten and wide open. The silence was over. It was time to make some noise. Elena Martinez proved that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting threats. It's the one quietly taking notes. She turned her pain into power and her silence into a strategy that took down a corrupt empire. Her story is a reminder that no matter how trapped you feel, the truth is a weapon that no amount of money can silence forever. What did you think of Elena's master plan? Would you have been able to stay that quiet for that long? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story of justice and karma, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.